So although we haven't been able to watch any sport on live for months, there's still been a lot of it on the TV. And if you rely on free to air, perhaps even more so than usual. And even though there aren't crowds sometimes, it's amazing how noisy it can still be sometimes. Even some of the golfers and footballers started making more noise, not just the tennis players. There's a lot of groaning going on. Players serving, driving, lifting. And if we're ever allowed back to the gym, it'll be the same as folks struggle to lift weights skywards. And it's not just humans. Engines straining also groan. If you strap a heavy trailer to a 4x4 and point it uphill, you'll hear the engine groan. Gears push against gears, the engines rev, and the truck groans as it strains forward. This is the sound of creation. Groaning is the sound of creation. As St. Paul says in our Romans reading, we know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now. It's such a vivid image, isn't it? Perhaps it isn't such a fantastic metaphor for women who have actually experienced labour pains, but it reminds us of the difficult work of creation. That work can be hard. The work can be groan-inducing. Groaning happens in a gap between what we are trying to do and what we see happening. Changing the direction of a tennis ball or hoisting a bar of weights. Groaning reminds us that the time spent in the gap between what is and what could be is a place of work, hard work. Our readings from the New Testament today are about living in this gap. We hear about the gap between creation as God intends it and wills it, and where we are now. Paul describes how to somehow live in optimism and hope in a world that so often doesn't fulfill what God promised to us. He calls this life in the Spirit. Paul's whole ministry in a way was driven to close this gap. Paul felt that he'd seen the fulfillment of creation in Jesus. He knew that fulfillment was within reach. He also knew the communities he preached to still lived with injustice, war, poverty, and suffering. He knows both the glory that is to come and the very present sufferings of the present time. He exhorts the Christians in Rome to live in the Spirit, because he also sees that glory is just beyond the gap. A life in the Spirit is a life lived free of hatred and violence, and instead filled with joy and reconciliation. A life in the Spirit is a way to live in the gap between what is and what shall be, in joyful exertion, not in desperation. And then this gap and how to live with it and in it is also at the heart of the gospel reading from Matthew today, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Sometimes the wheat and the tares, you might have heard it. And the first part of the passage paints a very vivid picture of the field and the way that the wheat and the weeds grow together and what we might try to do about it. If you read commentaries on this passage, there's often a lot of interesting stuff about what the weeds are and how difficult it is to tell them from the wheat when they're both growing. And that's all well and good. The trouble is that isn't what the parable's about. It's clear that very soon the workers in the field do notice that the weeds are there. They see the difference and they want to do something about it and get rid of them. And they want to do it now. They don't see any use in waiting. They want to move straight on into the action part. In the parable, however, the owner wants them to wait. He wants them to wait because he wants all the wheat to grow and produce grain for the harvest. And he doesn't want one bit of the wheat to be wasted. The most important thing is that every fruitful ear gets a chance to reach its maximum potential, even if that means the weeds grow as well. It's better to leave things be so that not one stalk of good wheat gets pulled up before it's time, whether it's because it's a case of mistaken identity or by collateral damage from the weeding process. This kind of waiting before going out to do the weeding means that we need to be content to live in the gap between what we see as now and what we want the result to be. The field isn't perfect. It looks a bit unkempt and we can all see what's wrong. We can see the things that shouldn't be there. We might even be able to see a few bits where the wheat is being a bit twisted out of shape by the weeds nearby. And it's hard to look at. And it's hard to sit by and wait and not do anything about it. However, I'm sure it must be even worse for the owner to look at. The owner who only sowed good seed and sees his plans all messed up by the work of an enemy. So maybe it is right, however hard it is for us to watch and wait before going in, to be content simply to carry on with our job of nurturing the field and encouraging as much grain as possible, rather than attacking the bad, whatever effect that has on what is good in the field. Things aren't totally right or wrong, however much we'd like them to be. The world is full of shades of grey. We're stuck with the grey because if you look at it, we are all a mixture of good wheat and weeds. We can all look at other people and say, but they're much worse than me. Yet there will be others who would say that about us. We can all see the weeds in the world and in others. We can see that there are weeds within our own lives. So how do we wait well? How do we live in the gap? First, I think we need to remember that we still need to notice the weeds, not pretend they aren't there. We need to say that things aren't as they should be. But the change needs to be made by growing the wheat, and in that way making the weeds less significant, rather than getting the scythe out. Sometimes that doesn't seem to help, or the whole situation seems too big to tackle. But being prepared to live in the gap, to groan with those people and situations which aren't as they should be, does make a difference. If we're not prepared to live in the gap with others, we simply stand by self-righteously and observe, and that won't help things grow. Secondly, I think we need to be realistic about how hard it can be living with the weeds, especially those in our own life, and how we need the help and support of others to keep on growing the wheat, rather than bewailing the weeds. And finally, I think we need to remember that God will come and reap the harvest, and he knows absolutely what is the wheat and what are the weeds. Even if we don't recognize all the weeds for what they are, God will still collect what is good. And so long as we haven't done any weeding, we won't have done any real damage. We are called to live in the gap and be gap closers. We are to see the distance between what should be and what is, and strain and heave and work and lift to close that gap. It may be necessary to groan, but the groans sing the soundtrack of creation. Let us be groaning with those people and situations which aren't as we would like them to be, or groaning to nurture the whole field, rather than groaning afterwards when we look back at all the good wheat we've uprooted as we were trying to get rid of the weeds. And let us feed and nurture the whole field, so that when the harvest comes, when God eventually does come and the wheat and the weeds are separated, the baskets of grain collected and saved will be good and full.